This presentation focuses on how de-Stalinization in the post-Stalin Soviet Union influenced public memory and commemoration by considering the challenges to de-Stalinization, how it was carried out, and how successful it was. Before assessing how de-Stalinization influenced Soviet public memory and commemoration, we have to start by acknowledging the background on the cult of personality that was possessed by both Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin. In 1917, Vladimir Lenin led the first successful communist revolution in world history when he and other revolutionaries overthrew a long history of gruesome Tsarist rule in the Russian Empire. Lenin was the leader of the Bolsheviks, which was the majority faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, and they took control by creating the Soviet Union. Despite being the head of the government, the Bolsheviks lacked the legitimacy needed to form the classless society that they had envisioned. Although it went against Marxist ideology and Lenin's modesty to create a cult of personality around a single leader, Lenin also knew that a strong leader was necessary to create a stable society. Lenin didn't want to create a cult of personality around him because he considered it to be vain and characteristic of the bourgeoisie. However, he couldn't stop one from forming around him, especially after his death. Against his own wishes, he was slowly being transformed into a godlike figure. After dodging an assassination attempt in 1918, many of his followers speculated that it was the work of God that kept him alive. In addition, many peasants considered him to be a divine Tsar-like figure when he confiscated land from nobles so that it could be redistributed to the peasants. After Lenin died in 1924, the Communist Party needed a way to maintain power since Lenin had not pointed out a clear successor. Lenin and Leninism became the physical embodiment that would unify the people with the Communist Party. So originally, Lenin wanted to be cremated and buried next to his mother, but as political figures tried to establish themselves as Lenin's successor, several of them advocated for the embalming of Lenin, knowing it would be popular with the people. His body represents what Petra Rethman calls the, quote, mirage of permanence. And so, although Lenin is gone, Leninism continues to influence the lives of the Soviet people every day. For example, many people created what were called Lenin corners, which were designated corners in rooms that were converted into a shrine for Lenin. Additionally, the city of Petrograd, which is modern-day St. Petersburg, was renamed Leningrad in his honor, and it would later become a city that was under a brutal siege by the Germans in World War II. Similarly, Joseph Stalin also had a Russian city named after him. A year after Lenin died, Tsaritsyn was renamed Stalingrad. Unlike Lenin, however, Stalin played a major role in creating his own cult of personality. So Stalin took advantage of his experience in being an editor of Pravda, which was the Communist Party newspaper that he worked for until he got a position in the Politburo. But he monopolized Pravda and used it to subtly distinguish himself amongst the other Politburo members. Pravda helped to highlight Stalin by often capturing him centered in group pictures, doctoring photos so that Stalin's attire stood out, suppressing photos of other Politburo members, and capitalizing his name in photo captions as well. Stalin also made efforts to be captured in pictures with sailors, aviators, and explorers because they were considered to be rugged heroes in the Soviet Union. It was also around this time that Stalin began to eliminate people that he considered threats to his leadership, which included many Red Army soldiers, priests, minorities, kulaks, and some of his own henchmen as well. There's a noticeable difference in the way Stalin presented his cult of personality after World War II. Despite not mobilizing the Soviet Union in time for the war, he led the Soviets to victory in Europe. After the war, he started to refer to himself as the Vozd, or the Supreme Leader. In propaganda posters, he was often depicted as the next Lenin or as a nurturing leader. Stalin's cult of personality was addressed for the first time in 1953 when Nikita Khrushchev gave a private speech to the 20th Party Congress called On the Cult of Personality and Its Consequences, which is also known as the Secret Speech. The Secret Speech introduced what we now know as the policy of de-Stalinization, but Khrushchev himself had never referred to it as de-Stalinization. Instead, he called it getting rid of the cult of personality. The Soviet government had to reshape the public memory of Stalin because they couldn't completely denounce Stalin's 30 years of communist leadership without undermining the entire communist system itself. However, the Soviet government could denounce Stalin's leadership by exposing his cult of personality, which inherently went against communist ideology. The Soviet government drew differences between Lenin and Stalin's cult of personality. The Soviet government argued that Lenin did not have a cult of personality because he lacked excessive vanity. They also justified his leadership as a necessary part of the revolution. In contrast, Stalin's doctored photos, revision of history books, and propaganda posters demonstrated his excessive vanity, which he would later use to abuse his power and commit political terror. In addition to pointing out his cult of personality, the Soviet government tried to reshape public memory of Stalin by painting him as a mentally unstable ruler. Over time, Soviet people became accustomed to praising Stalin's leadership no matter the circumstances. When leaders like Nikita Khrushchev claimed that Stalin's great terror was due to his paranoia, Stalin no longer appeared as an indestructible figure to the Soviet people. Now that the Soviet people could question Stalin as a person, they could also question his practices and policies rather than the communist ideology itself. Finally, the Soviet government reshaped public memory by pushing forward a new narrative that would revive Leninism. Although Lenin initially held Stalin in high regard, the Soviet government emphasized that Lenin did not want Stalin as his successor. Lenin paid close attention to Stalin's power-hungry attitude when he was appointed as the General Secretary of the Communist Party. Lenin noted, quote, "I'm not sure that he will always know how to use his power with sufficient caution," end quote. After the atrocities of Stalin's terror were addressed by the Soviet leaders in public, Lenin's correct presumption instilled faith in him as the godlike leader once again. The Soviet government used this as an opportunity to establish Leninism as the only acceptable form of communism for the USSR. After reshaping public memory and pushing forward a new narrative of Stalin, de-Stalinization now manifested into iconoclasm and removing Stalin's influence from Soviet society in a physical way as well. In 1961, the city of Stalingrad was renamed to Volgograd. Although most de-Stalinization occurred in secret, renaming the city had to occur publicly. As a result, the decision was controversial because the city of Stalingrad had a battle in World War II that was a turning point for the Soviets. So, just like Leningrad, Stalingrad was a city of resistance and morale for the Soviet people. However, Leningrad would not be renamed to St. Petersburg until the collapse of the USSR in 1991. In 1962, the world's largest Stalin monument in Prague was destroyed after only being resurrected for 7 years. The monument of Stalin leading Czechs and Russians toward communism could be seen from any part of the city. Now, only the base of the monument is left. Also in 1962, Walter Ulbricht of East Berlin praised the 22nd Party Congress of the USSR for its efforts in de-Stalinization. He gave a speech praising their actions just after the 22nd Party Congress voted to remove East Berlin's Stalin Ali movement overnight. However, I argue that the most successful part of de-Stalinization occurred in 1961 when Stalin's body was secretly removed from Lenin's mausoleum and reburied near the Kremlin wall overnight. As mentioned before, Lenin's body was embalmed and put in a mausoleum in Moscow. To this day, Lenin's body rests in what Petra Rethman describes as, quote, a combination of both an Egyptian pyramid and a tomb, end quote, because it exhibits and buries his body at the same time. His body is dressed in a simple black suit, and his mustache is perfectly manicured. It lies under a dim light that brightens the red and gold marble. On the outside of the mausoleum, Lenin's name is engraved over the entrance. One of the main advocates for Lenin's embalmment was Joseph Stalin. When Stalin died in 1953, he also wanted to be embalmed and put in Lenin's mausoleum. Stalin's name was also engraved below Lenin's on the outside. When Stalin's body was put in the mausoleum, the amount of medals on his martial uniform created a different spectacle for visitors. While the simplicity of Lenin's attire seemed to speak for itself, the military medals on Stalin's uniform signaled vanity and excessive power. The 22nd Party Congress secretly voted to remove Stalin's body from the mausoleum on the night of October 30th, 1961. Overnight, Stalin's body was removed and buried next to the Kremlin wall. Stalin's name was also removed from the entrance. The grave now features a simple gravestone headed by Stalin's bust. The reason that this removal is so important is because the Soviet government embalmed and displayed Lenin's body to symbolize the immortality of Leninism in the Soviet Union. By removing Stalin's embalmed body and burying it without a public memorial, the Soviet government was clearly signaling that they did not want Stalin's influence to continue after his death. In conclusion, de-Stalinization worked to eliminate Stalin's influence from Soviet society without delegitimizing Soviet communism as a whole. However, the physical destruction of the influence could not have been done without changing public memory of Stalin by exposing his cult of personality. Additionally, the Soviet government pushed forward a new narrative by consciously preserving Lenin, literally through embalming his body, but also by using his body to represent the continuation of Leninism and the Communist Revolution.